slowly we have people trickling in. So, okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the RIC webinar series. I will be an alternate host for you today, and really excited to be here today with you to bring the work of Vikalp Sangam, to you. Vikalp Sangam is, as described earlier in Hindi, means, confluence of alternatives. And it is, we have with us Ashish and Joy, who will be sort of sharing with us the many ways in which Vikalp Sangam is a confluence. But they work across disciplines, fields of work, and practitioners to really look at what are the alternatives, both that are emerging and that have already existed in our communities, as addressing systemic issues arising from our sort of dominant systems of, politics, economy, and general sort of social structures. So, I'm really, really excited to have Joy and Ashish join us. Both of them are lifelong activists and practitioners in development issues and environment issues. Joy has worked for, over 3 decades in water-related conflict, water and including water conflict in India. And Ashish is also a very well-known and respected environmentalist and activist working on a number of development issues in India. The work of Vikalp Sangam we'll be getting into today is both around what is Vikalp Sangam, what is a confluence of, why is it so important that an organization, an institution, maybe not an institution, but a gathering like Vikalp Sangam exists? Why is it maybe, and this is so pertinent to the UNDP, I think, perspective on why is it so important that we acknowledge the alternatives, but also document alternatives that pre-exist such that they're codified. And we speak a lot about that in our own work, particularly with ACT Lab colleagues and innovation colleagues on, we hear the words blog and writing, and why does it really matter that we, put pen to paper on some of the work that we're doing, so that it becomes more tangible and accessible to others. And we will also be sharing, Ashish and Joy will also be sharing examples really in real life of what are these systemic issues and what are the alternatives that are emerging in India as well as the region. So they will largely focus on India, but bring in their work on the new emerging Southeast Asia network on alternatives, as well as the South Asia Vikalp Sangam. And I believe, Ashish, you will also talk a little bit more about your work related to the Radical Ecological Democracy Network. Both of them are prolific writers and have, both co-edited as well as edited separately a number of books on alternative futures and development issues, touching on India and as well as global issues. So with that, over to Ashish to, oh, and just as a quick, point of note, we will have our Q&A at the end. But maybe if bandwidth permits, Ashish and Joy had both requested that this webinar be an internal UNDP gathering as opposed to open to public, so that it can be a bit more of an intimate conversation. So if bandwidths permit, we would love cameras on, so that it feels more like a gathering in person, well, as much as we can in our sort of virtual spaces. But Q&A will happen at the end, and really encourage you all to just put your hand up and I'll call on you and turn your cameras on. And thanks, Bisam. And with that, thank you so much, Ashish and Joy. Over to you, Ashish.
Thanks a lot, Pratiksha and Courtney, for organizing this. Great opportunity for us to speak to colleagues in different parts of Asia and Pacific. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, to you all. What Joy and I will do is to share this presentation in 2 bits. First is I'm going to run through some of the sorts of initiatives on the ground that we have been working with or familiar with, on the basis of which Vikalp Sangam and other related processes have worked out some kind of a broad understanding of what is the sort of alternative vision and alternative practice that's emerging in this region, which can challenge and confront the currently dominant economic, political, social systems. So I'll go through that first, and then Joy will come in with looking at the Vikalp Sangam process itself, why it started, what we've been doing, and what's emerged out of it. So about 15 minutes each, 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we'd love to have an open discussion. So let me start with, are you able to see the slides? Pratiksha,
Yes, can see.
you're seeing the slides and
Ashish,
full
yeah.
screen? Okay.
Yes.
So this part is something that I don't think any of us need to really go into. This is something you're all familiar with. Anybody working on development issues knows that current models of development, especially based on perpetual economic growth at any cost, are literally at any cost. So we see the ecological damage that they cause. We also see the social and cultural damage of uprooting communities, of destroying cultures, of homogenizing ways of life, and also then, of course, the psychological impact on and social impact on each one of us as individuals. So it's a process that I've been calling moving from livelihoods, which were occupations that were connected to everyday life, to society, to culture, to ecology, and so on, to deadlihoods, which are the killing of vast numbers of those sorts of livelihoods, especially those that were directly dependent on nature and natural resources, and the creation in the modern economy of mostly the kind of jobs that are soul deadening, mass production. We're just cogs in a huge, massive global chain of production, and very little chances of expressing our own creativity. And the separation between work and leisure, which is a hallmark of the kind of what David Graeber, who recently passed away, called bullshit jobs. So that's sort of broadly, and of course, I'm talking a little black and white here, but broadly the sort of process. And then what we've seen in COVID times is both states and corporations are using this as an excuse or a reason for increasing authoritarianism. We're certainly seeing that in India, we're seeing it in many parts of the world. And corporations, of course, are also seeing it as a way of increasing profits. So I think the top 10 billionaires have increased their wealth by $600 billion in the last few months, even as hundreds of millions of people are losing their jobs or have lost their livelihoods. But on the other hand, we've also seen some amazing examples of community resilience, of people getting together for acts of solidarity, for trying to figure out how we can survive in the kind of economic lockdown or health crisis that we're in, through moving away from the kind of individualistic, selfish ways of being to much more collective living, helping each other, going back to looking at how farming or forestry or other sorts of occupations can provide much more self-reliance and decent and dignified livelihoods. So in a sense, it's like that we're at a crossroads. We've been saying that every time, every few years, everybody says we're at a crossroads. But I think this possibly unprecedented interregnum in human history. I don't think we've ever had something like this before. Has at a global scale has given us the opportunity to move in a direction which asks the fundamental questions of what it is for human beings to be on the earth, what it is for human beings to be happy and satisfied, and what is well-being, what is wealth, and kind of question some of the sort of dominant answers and structures that we've been living with. So part of the response over the last many decades, of course, and including now, has been resistance. And like Pratiksha, you mentioned, looking at the sort of currently dominant structures of inequality, unsustainability, exploitation, marginalization, which lie in terms of in their roots in of course ancient patriarchy and masculinity, but also capitalism, state domination, um, and the domination of human beings over other species, so anthropocentrism. Then, of course, we see racism and so on. And so, resistance to that in different parts of the world. So, what the picture that you're seeing here is of a movement against two large hydro projects that would have displaced 300 villages and destroyed all that forest that you see in the background back by Adivasis, indigenous people, and they were successful. But why I'm showing this is also because what they were articulating when they were protesting was not just that we will lose our livelihoods, but that the river is our mother and we won't allow it to be shackled. That's a very different way of looking at nature and natural resources, nature as natural resources to be exploited. But traditional communities have, for centuries or millennia, looked at nature as us being part of nature and looked at it in a very different way. Similarly, of course, resistance against things like water privatization in Jakarta and many, many others across our region that we've been seeing in the last many decades. But at the same time, as we resist, people are coming up with all kinds of grounded alternatives for meeting needs and aspirations, because there is deprivation, there is actual poverty, there is hunger, there is discrimination, there is inequality. So constructive work and alternatives are also needed in order to meet those sorts of challenges. In the last few years, we've been documenting, partly through the Vikalp Sangam process and others, these sorts of grounded alternatives. What's emerging? How are they? Why are people doing this? What are the results? And how does it challenge the dominant system? So I'm going to just give a few examples of this. This is also, we've recently got in touch with a network of people, organizations in Southeast Asia, which are doing something very similar, at least in terms of documentation, and also then bringing them together. They recently, in fact, just 2 or 3 weeks back, had this very interesting conference on alternative regionalism for the ASEAN region through the ASEAN People's Forum. And similar things are happening across also. I'll give a couple of examples from other parts of the Asia and Pacific, but similar things are also happening across the world. I'll give a link to a recent book that we produced called Pluriverse, which has 100 examples of these kinds of very grounded radical alternatives, both practical and conceptual and worldview wise. That obviously we don't have the time today to go into all of these, but there's some really amazing things happening. So just to take a few examples from India, this is for me actually has been the most inspiring example of the ones that I have been familiar with and engaged with to some extent. This is over the last 30 years, a group of about 4,000, 5,000 Dalit women farmers. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Indian caste system and know that Dalits are the most oppressed, the most marginalized and exploited section of Indian society. And as women, of course, also in a highly masculinist or patriarchal society. So in that sense, if you saw their condition 30 years back, they were amongst the most severely deprived in terms of food, in terms of health access, education access, and everything else that we see in these sorts of families and this community. In the last 30 years, through mobilizing collectives in about 75 villages, bringing back their traditional seeds, taking full control over the land, the seeds, the water, and the knowledge, which means moving towards what they say is not just food security, but food sovereignty. That is our community control over everything to do with food and no dependence on corporations or the government. They have actually moved to completely transforming those situations of deprivation to one where, for instance, during the COVID period, in these last 8 months, there's been absolutely no problem with food in any of those families. And in fact, they have contributed to the food relief processes in the region by giving free food to those who don't have it, to the landless or to others, workers and so on. But there was also a big push about land rights for women, which is highly unusual in India. Mostly women don't have land rights. They've created grain banks in each of those villages. They've also gone beyond agriculture to move into community media. They have their own radio station. They make their own films. They ran a school for quite a long time on their own, and so on. So I mean, I can go on for 2 hours just on this initiative, but it's one of those which actually shows. And by the way, this is dry land farming, no external irrigation, just whatever rainfall comes. So completely self-reliant and self-sufficient, especially with regard to food, in what, as I said, was a highly deprived and exploitative situation. Similar thing is there in Bangladesh with something called the Nayakrishi Andolan, many thousands of farmers involved with this. Again, a lot of the leadership by women, but basically asserting that their own ways of life, their own ways of agriculture are far superior and much more resilient to the Green Revolution, the kind of imposition of technologies and models of the Green Revolution that have been brought into South Asia by Indian and international institutions. We see other examples in other sectors. So, for instance, with crafts across South Asia, with industrialization and the kind of government policies we've had, crafts have severely declined. Most handicrafts have severely declined. But here in Kachchh, in Western India, there's been a revival of handloom based on the regeneration of a particular local indigenous variety of cotton, which is grown organically and with very little rainfall. The creation of new products using the same old traditional heritage of handloom weaving, but with new products and all that have created their own market. And because of that, in fact, young people and women who were otherwise, women especially, were never sitting on the loom and making products, they have come into it. And there's in fact a reverse migration away from industries, and even the Middle East people coming back, young people coming back into handloom weaving. And it's quite amazing if you see the kind of articulation they have of why they're doing it. It's not just about economic livelihoods. It's also the pride in their own heritage. It's being able to work with the family. It's being able to be in control of your own time, of being your own boss rather than being at the dictates of some capitalist owner or whatever. So there's all kinds of these sorts of narratives of a mix of psychological satisfaction, cultural aspects, social aspects, and of course also the economic livelihoods. And there are many examples across India where villages have kind of revived themselves in many different ways, and there has been either a much less out migration or a reverse migration. And in today's context of COVID, where millions of workers have had to go back home because they've lost their jobs in cities and in industrial areas, this kind of approach becomes really, really crucial. How does one revitalize the village economy, including dealing with issues of caste and gender and so on? One should never forget that. To be able to provide situations of dignified livelihoods so that people don't are not forced to migrate out. But of course, we also need to look at cities. So we've been trying to document alternative initiatives in urban areas also. This is a very interesting example of a civil society led initiative called Homes in the City, which is trying to create the conditions of local empowerment where people can take control over their own lives in the city in terms of housing, water, energy, but especially local governance, trying to actually implement in a much more effective way India's constitutional provisions for urban so local self-governance, which has mostly been ignored or not been allowed. But here, people have asserted that they will do that, and this is mostly people in so-called slums or the poorer colonies. And what brings to us the sort of notion of a different form of democracy is from indigenous peoples in forested parts of central India who have reclaimed their collective rights to forests. And this, as we know, is a movement across many parts of the world of indigenous people or other local communities, fishing communities, etc., trying to reclaim their territorial control rather than have centralized bureaucracies controlling them, as in India, the forest department. So they've done that, they managed to reclaim those rights, and now they govern and manage the entire area of forests, but in ways that try and ensure conservation, but also sustainable livelihoods for for the entire population. And their slogan for many of these villages is that while we elect the government in Delhi or Mumbai, we are the government in our village. So it's a very different notion of democracy, which I'll come back to when I look at the framework. Similar initiatives in many parts of the world across South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific. I know, for instance, of the Pacific, of these locally managed marine areas, which are incredible, much larger area of community-led conservation than, in fact, the official protected areas in that part of the world. And similarly, for instance, in the Philippines, reclaiming ancestral domain rights using one of the oldest laws in the region, and then being able to sustainably use and conserve the area and keep out destructive activities. In many other areas of the world, again, also amazing alternatives to education, which becomes so very central to all of this because the way young children are taught or what they're taught, uh, you know, either creates a group of people who are responsible to each other and to nature and to society, or who are basically just individualistic, selfish, I, me, mine, selfie kind of thing. Unfortunately, most education is of the second kind. But here are examples of alternative education, alternative media, arts, technology, which try and create the situation for much more collective, responsible, connected to nature, rooted in one's own culture, but also learning from other cultures, looking at equality and dignity in ways that are very different from the dominant mindset. And also being able to speak the truth, unlike, unfortunately, what most mainstream media does. So, just putting it all together, I'll end in the next 2-3 minutes. We also see, of course, that as these sorts of things happen and as public pressure builds up, governments also do respond. Not as if everything the government does is problematic. There are spaces within the government for creating the kinds of policy shifts which will then enable those transformations at a larger scale, or in areas that where it hasn't yet happened. And there are many examples of this from different parts of the world. So I should stress none of these are perfect. They all have their own issues and problems and weaknesses, but I think they all show us the potential for the kind of transformation that we see. And just putting it together, this is something that's emerged from the Vikalp Sangam process. We call it the flower of transformation, looking at 5 different spheres of where change and radical systemic transformation is taking place or should be taking place further. So obviously, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but basically we're saying if it's politics, the top right-hand sphere, we're talking about not just elections and representative structures, which is what democracy has been about so far, but really about direct radical democracy, where wherever I am in my collective, I claim power because it is inherent to me. But when I exercise that power, I'm exercising power to do things with others rather than over others. Similarly, with economic democracy, moving away from sort of stronghold of state and capitalism, capitalists on our economy, on our production, on our consumption, to looking at how producers and consumers can take back control of the economy, of how the economy can be much more respectful of exchange and relationships of caring and sharing, such as, for instance, what women do completely unrecognized, and how it can be much more about the commons than the private. Similarly, then, both of these have to be accompanied with struggles for social justice. I keep mentioning caste, gender, but there are many others. We've seen anti-racism movements around the world. So that has to be part of this, because otherwise, localized democracy and economy can also be extremely oppressive. Accompanying this on the bottom left-hand side is the whole issue of cultural and knowledge diversity and commons, rather than privatization and rather than the sort of hegemonic domination of one religion or one faith or one mode of knowledge on all others, which is what we see. And underlying all of this, of course, is the ecological resilience. Now, at the center of this flower of transformation is a set of values. And this is something that we've learned from these different initiatives, not just cooked up from the air. I'm going to just leave this up on the slide. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into this, but to me, what binds alternative initiatives across the world together, and what the approach we take, therefore, is not to replicate any of these somewhere else, but to say, okay, what are the principles and lessons we've learned? What are the processes that have worked? How have hurdles been overcome? And then learning those applied in my own context, with my own environmental situation, my own economic situation, my own political ideology, whatever. But these are the threads, and we'll speak a little later about how both the Vikalp Sangam and the sort of global process that we recently initiated is based on understanding these and identifying and being able to enhance these sorts of common threads of values, of ethics, of principles, of worldviews that celebrate not money and fame and power, but life, that sort of reassert that at the core of all of this is a respect for life. In India, some of us have called it Ecoswaraj. The word Swaraj comes from ancient India, repopularized by Gandhi during the independence movement, but it's much more than independence from colonial powers. It's really about autonomy as an individual, as a collective, but in responsibility to everybody else's autonomy also. So it's not like a free for all, and which then necessarily means that we're also sensitive to social equality issues, equity issues, and ecological sustainability issues. There are similar worldviews, different parts of the world, and that's the book that I mentioned earlier, which has about 100 examples of these from around the world. So I'm going to stop there. There's, of course, much more that one can talk about, and many issues and many questions, many unresolved things like what, do we need a state? What would be the nature of the state in a situation like this? How would the economy exactly be governed and managed and owned, etc.? There's lots of different questions, but I'm going to leave it right now. There's much more available on these websites, and happy to enter into a discussion. So with that, over to Joy. I'll stop sharing. Okay, Joy, over to you.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Ashish, and thanks a lot to Pratiksha and Courtney for setting this up. So whatever, at time spans you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I just start sharing my screen, and I also probably put off my video because I think my connectivity is a little bad today. So let me do that. Yeah. Let me know. Sorry. Is this visible to everybody?
Yes, can
Yeah,
see.
maybe you can make it full screen. Yeah, that's fine.
It's not full. Is this?
No, that's fine.
That's fine. Yeah. So basically, I'm trying to build on what Ashish just spoke about. He also spoke about why, in a way, the whole basis on which Vikalp Sangam, or what in English called Alternatives Confluences, in the last maybe, which we began around 2014, started, I think, and also some of the real world examples which he brought in, which is actually trying to ground some of these alternatives which we are talking about in different socio-cultural, agroclimatic, or other type of biophysical settings in the country and things. So what I will try to do is that the type of processes involved in this, why are we coming together, what type of work we do through these collective processes. So some of that is a little more of a very here and now type of thing, which I'm going to talk about it. And then later, probably in the Q&A discussions, we can take some of the details for discussions and things. Vikalp Sangam is a process to basically bring together the various initiatives in the country, which is talking about either conceptualizing a different way of doing things, what we call broadly alternatives, actual experiences and things. So it is a process to bring together individuals, groups, organizations, social movements who have been either in terms of conceptualizing or in an alternative ways of doing things, or actually doing alternatives on their own context and things. So it is a process to bring together all these groups and initiatives together into one common space to do this. In fact, one of the needs, I think, which is also partly Ashish mentioned, is that most of us are involved in our daily day-to-day struggles in terms of resisting things, movements, agitations, or whenever the government comes up with a particular project, whether it's a dam project or a hydropower or other type of infrastructure projects and things, then we, generally we get to the mode of opposing that. And that is the first step. I think that is an important thing to be done. But in this whole daily preoccupation with, resisting whatever is coming on our way, sometimes either we don't have the mental space or the energy or even the inclination to define, articulate what type of future we need. What is that vision which is, helping us to resist some of these type of destructive projects and initiatives of the state? So we thought that, in fact, in what Gramsci used to call, how do you create the counter hegemonies of the people themselves, the toiling people? Especially in a capitalist society, resistance alone doesn't work. I think the way sophisticated manner the state operates, either through policies or other type of initiatives, or the whole so-called developmentalism of the state and things. So unless we also develop alternatives for the people and try to mobilize people on an alternative agenda, then probably we cannot really take on a capitalist state and things. So in fact, in a way, it is also built on Gramsci's conceptualization of counter hegemonies, things. So this is a space to articulate, discuss, understand and things. So basically this is a platform basically to share with each other what's happening on this alternative space, critique each other. Otherwise, for example, I've been working on, let's say, water sector for the last 30 years, but I don't remember a conversation I'm having with people who are working on, let's say, health issues, though health and water are very intimately related and things. Or so there are various other things. So we are also trying to get out of the silos of our own working and understanding and try to learn from each other, make connectivity of issues as well as the type of work we do, and also critique in a friendly manner. If you think that, okay, there is something which you can add to the, for example, if I look at water from a health perspective, there are many things which probably I can add to the perspective around water and things. So it's a question of a space of self-critiquing, mutually critiquing, learning, sharing a type of space. And also we hope to develop some type of a conceptual framework as we go along, theoretically, which can hold together, together the different type of alternative, which actually Ashish gave a glimpse of things and things. So, so this is space. So what I said is that basically sharing, learning from each other, critiquing, developing further, and also try to build on the actual experience to more of a conceptual framework of a different type of world. So how do you bring that theoretically, some of these issues into discussion and things. In fact, so Kalpavriksha took the initiative in getting these organizations, individuals together sometime in 2014. I think before we launched the actual Vikalp Sangam, I think we had a couple of meetings to discuss the various nitty-gritties of this whole initiative, because it's not an easy thing to hold such a diverse set of groups and people together under one platform or a network and things. So basically, just to summarize what it is, provide a platform for people working in these to come together for sharing, learning, and collaborating, especially across sectors. Second, I think partly also Ashish mentioned in terms of help document and understand and make more visible the ongoing practical and conceptual alternative in all fields of human endeavor. In fact, I think that's the glimpse which Ashish should to provide from different parts of the country, what people are doing. Engage in collective visioning of a better future, and what are the type of pathways to go there and things. So many of these sangams which we have a whole lot of discussions about these issues. As I said earlier, contribute to the possibility of a critical political mass that can more effectively challenge and change the systems in a more systematic, the type of systemic forces against which, what are the types of structural inequities in the country, the type of unsustainable developmental pathways, and which the state brings in and type of things. How do you take on these things? So ultimately, we also hope that this Vikalp Sangam or Alternatives Confluence will also lead to forming some type of a network or something which you can also politically engage with some of these issues in a long-term manner. That's why one of the reasons this is just not a network of what you call non-governmental organizations, like typically we call NGOs, which are doing. There are also people who are working in the mass movements or more into the social movement mode of doing things. So that's what. So in terms of the programs and activities which it takes up as, one of the main things is to organize different types of Vikalp Sangams or alternative confluences. In fact, we have been doing, at least maybe 4 or 5 of them in every year from 2014 onwards. This has been happening. So we do regional sangams, like for example, or a state. Sangams like a particular state, like we had one in Kerala, we had one in Telangana, or regional sangams like Western Himalayas and other things. Or we also do basically what we call thematic sangams. Thematic sangams would mean that you pick up a particular issue. Now, for example, renewable energy was one of the themes which there was a Vikalp Sangam which took place in Bihar, state of India. And also there were a lot of interesting follow-ups regarding that. Or we also had one on food. Food is an important thing, and how localized food and other type of things. How do we take it? What is the people doing? How do we learn from groups which have been working on the whole issue of food, alternative agriculture, seeds, and whole lot of issues and things. And we also organized national sangams I think 2017 we had one, where is something like a national confluence where people working on different alternatives come to a national platform and and I think this is a move also to, I think, as Ashish was saying, to take us something in the Southeast Asian context also. So that is how this whole network is expanding. The picture which you see on your right side is a youth Vikalp Sangam, which was done in 2019. And things. It's organized by a interesting college called Bhumi College, based in Bangalore. So just to give you a bit of a rundown on the type of Sangams which we discussed. So first we had one in Andhra Pradesh in 2014. That was organized, I mean, at a space called Timbuktu Collective. This is a very interesting initiative there. It's not only regeneration of the land and the agriculture and type of things. So there are a whole lot of activities that have been taken up, working with about more than 300 villages in that area, which is a highly drought-prone region. So that was the space which was organized. Then we had one in Tamil Nadu. We had one in Ladakh in 2015. And in Ladakh, I would like to report that even after the Sangam, there were a whole lot of follow-up activities which are done, especially on the issue of waste management, because of the whole type of heavy tourism into Ladakh and Leh area. So waste management became a very important issue, and the groups there tried to work with the local urban development body there and try to take up some of these issues and find this. Maharashtra, we had one in 2015. We had one in Kachchh. As I said, in Western Himalaya, there was one in 2016. Kerala, that's the southernmost small state in India, that's in 2017. We had one in Madhya Pradesh, and we had a second one in Western Himalayas and things, and there's one more planned, that time. In terms of thematic, this one we had this energy democracy, which I mentioned, which was in 2016 in Bihar. There was one on food sovereignty, two actually, in 2016 and 17. The other one was about youth. In fact, that's also an interesting process which is happening. The Vikalp Sangam, the youth sections are pretty active, and they have been meeting quite often to discuss things. And they had two Sangams in 2017 and 19. The National Sangam took place in 2017. In fact, there's another interesting thing which took place, that was on peace in conflict areas. There are many parts of India, especially indigenous people are much more concentrated. There are areas either because of state violence or also some of the other groups which are involved in type of things. So violence has been a main issue, or Northeast is also another hotspot for different type of violences is taking. So how do we conceptualize that? So that was on 2018. We had one on health. I think the health group within the Vikalp Sangam was pretty active, especially during the COVID pandemic times. Also, there were quite a bit of initiatives on that. Well-being itself, this was in 2019, on democracy and economy. So I think this was done in Pondicherry, which was done. So we can find that there's a whole diversity of issues and themes which have been picked up to engage with collectively and things. And I think on each of this Sangam, there's a report which is there on the Vikalp Sangam Alternatives Confluence website, which you can access and things. And also that time we had planned on media, arts, data, the whole question of different types of challenges, challenged people, or what you call disabilities and things. I just want to run through a few of the visuals which we do, which will also tell you, what type of things happen during the Vikalp Sangam. This is the type of collective, the people we gathered to the first Vikalp Sangam which we had in Andhra Pradesh that time in 2014. This is the participants which were gathered there. As part of the Vikalp Sangam, we also do a lot of collective activities. One is the type of cultural evenings we spend, the local dances, the songs, folk songs, people do paintings and other things also. And also it is an opportunity to connect the local people there. In fact, in the dance, you can see that people in and around the Timbuktu collective came together an evening, and their own folk songs and dance were performing, and also the participants joined. So it's like a exchange with the local people there, their cultural medium and things. We also do, wherever it is possible, do, collective walking, bird watching, hiking, and other type of things, which is also in a way help to bond different people who come from different parts of the country and things. There's another interesting thing that we also put up a self-introduction type of a thing, which is people pin up what they want to do, what they're doing, what the type of thing. Very creatively, people do pin it up somewhere. And this is also an opportunity to know each other, make connections. So one of the things which happens in the Vikalp Sangam process, not only the collective thing which we collectively decide to do, there are also quite a bit of individual to individual, organized to organization collaborations which take place. Now, for example, if I am interested in either renewable energy or water, then I see people who are also doing similar type of work or interested in that type of thing. So it's also a platform to develop that type of partnerships across groups and individuals and things. So this is also form of how the type of seating is done. There are no platforms in which people sit on some type of things. Much more of a, you create an atmosphere of equity, non-hierarchical way of discussions and conducting dialogues. And language was never a problem, because we have had it in multi-language issues. So here the issues that have a much more easy-paced discussions, and people can talk in any language which they feel comfortable. And there is a translation facility which is done so that because of language, nobody should be apprehensive to talk or other type of things. So this is which I find personally has been able to the Vikalp Sangams have been able to do quite well. So you can find whole diversity of people, whether it is the local languages, Hindi or English, any language. So language has now been a barrier for this type of conversations and dialogues to take place. This is the picture from the Energy Vikalp Sangam we had in Bodh Gaya. I'm sure some of you know the importance of Bodh Gaya, because that's a place where Buddha, this one, and it's also a huge pilgrimage center today. I think this is also an interaction with the community members. So sometimes, wherever possible, we also have one evening spent with the local communities, trying to understand their issues and engage with them in a discussion and dialogue. This is a site of that renewable energy, solar energy, which is done at the site of the conference. This is from the Kachchh Vikalp Sangam, which was held in a place called Bhuj there. I think some of the examples which is there from Bhuj, I think in terms of actual alternatives, I think Ashish has already spoken to us. This is also in Bhuj, where a whole lot of weaving communities are there, hand-based, handlooms and other type of. This is one thing. There's a lot of interesting work which is being done, and I think Vikalp Sangam also has documented stories about this. You can find them in the Vikalp Sangam website about this. Also, in some places we do some of the creative, constructive activities. This is a site where the participants of the Vikalp Sangam try to plant trees in the area where they were there. This is the picture from the Ladakh Vikalp Sangam, which I mentioned in 2015. In fact, in the Vikalp Sangams, the one interesting thing is the food which is being served. So basically, it's all local food there, which is served. Is very, it was an eye opener to me, the type of food variety and diversity which we have in the country. And in a globalizing world, especially people from the cities never sees this type of varieties which are there. It's a very nutritious food, locally grown, and things. So, and every Vikalp Sangam which is held in different parts of the country, I think food has been. In fact, I think I would say it's also one of the attractions for people to come, because you get to taste food which you have never done earlier in your life, and the type of diversity which you can bring in. This is a picture from the Western Himalaya. We had the first one was a mini Vikalp. It was a full-fledged Vikalp Sangam, because only a few people could put it. It was more of a preparatory type of thing for a much larger one. This is Western Himalayas. If you've seen, there is this institute called Sambhavana Trust. If you look at the lady who is sitting there, I think I just forget her name now. I think we call her Didi actually. She has actually designed the entire buildings in that institution, which is much more done with mud construction and things, much more of an eco-friendly way. It's beautifully done. It's one place, in case anybody wants to visit India, I think one should really go and spend some time in this institute. They also organize a lot of programs there, training programs and other type of conversations across on issues, socio-political conversations and other things. One of the things which also do as part of the Vikalp Sangam process is set up of a self-reflection processes at an individual organization level, and how do we connect with some of these basic principles around alternatives and things. How do you? So there's a time space for that. Very often, as part of the Vikalp Sangam, generally the Vikalp Sangams are over a 4 or 5 day period. So one day is spent in actually going to the field where some of these alternatives are being grounded by the particular organization which is hosting the Vikalp Sangam. So one full day we go into see the actual experiences, reflect on that, and spend time in the common discussions to bring forth the type of issues what we have learned from this. So it's not only just sitting in a room and discussing things, but we also try to learn from actual experiences in that particular area on a particular theme or a particular issue. This is a picture of the food Sangam which was held in Odisha in 2016. So you can see the type of variety of things which are being served as. In fact, the person who is speaking is one of the persons in India who have been talking about alternative agriculture and food sovereignty and things. And in the book, which Ashish mentioned, Alternative Futures, India Unshackled. In fact, we have a collective article by him and a few others on, food Swaraj and this and alternative consideration of agriculture itself and things. This also thing which people had brought to showcase in the different variety of things which are available around this. You can see, yes. So again, I'm talking about the food here, which is the main attraction and thing. So this is a picture of youth Vikalp Sangam, and I'm very happy to report that especially over the time, we find within the Vikalp Sangam process is more and more young people taking responsibility for different things in the Vikalp Sangam. Now, for example, we have something which I think probably I'll talk to you later called Vikalp Varta, especially after the pandemic started. This regular webinar-based dialogues is taking place. It's all anchored by the young people across the country and things. So this is a process. There are many organizations which are dedicatedly working on youth issues or with youth coming together and taking this forward. And I think there is also a charter or a type of a perspective which has been put out now. It's like a youth perspective on all issues. This also collectively discussed, and I talked about the national Vikalp Sangam. This was close to Udaipur, I think 2017, which we had. So it was more like all the groups which have been connected with the Vikalp Sangam processes coming together. If my information is right, so far we have had only one national Vikalp Sangam which was held.
Joy, I think maybe we can start concluding.
Yeah, I'll just start concluding. Yeah. So this one of the last part is that one of the important areas, discussion parts of the Vikalp Sangam in all the Vikalp Sangam is discussing the whole framework note, which I think Ashish also mentioned. In fact, what I put on the screen is the 6th version of the Vikalp Sangam. This is a document which, actually more like a work in progress. With each Vikalp Sangam, this gets, further developed and further fine-tuned and things. So it's a very collective effort. So this is more like that, which I mentioned, one of the purposes of this Vikalp Sangam is to develop a theoretical or a conceptual framework to tie together this. So this also talks about the key aspects and principles, or later what Ashish mentioned about this whole interconnected integrating circles, the main pillars around which this Vikalp Sangam is that is also being now further developed into further variables on each of these, and also indicators. How do you actually measure and whether we are moving to something of this like? The second type of activity is the documentation dissemination. So far, I think, this is the website in which you can find all these very interesting positive stories across the country and also maybe outside. So far, we have something about 1,500 stories and perspective pieces on this. There is more than about 100 films which have been commissioned by the Vikalp Sangam processes on different alternatives, which are all there in the website, which you can attach. The third thing that we also take public stance on issues. Now, for example, I think one of the, before the election, we brought out a People's Manifesto for a just, equitable and sustainable India, which is also there on the Vikalp Sangam. During the COVID, we also made out a public stand and public position about that, how the government is doing and what should be an alternative way of looking at that. There's a statement. When Jammu Kashmir issue, when the present government divided that in the made Ladakh as a union territory, giving this. So we made try to understand what is the type of potential and problems, prospects and issues related to that. So there is a statement. So, or whenever some of these socio-political issues come up, then the Sangam tries to take a public stand and put it across and things. I think just this also in terms of decision making, funding, I would say it's a more of a non-hierarchical democratic way of functioning. There's a core group which is considered of all the groups and things, and it's a representation from that, which takes most of the decisions within the core group. We meet quite often, at least once a year, or now maybe twice a year. I think this year we are planning, maybe in December, we are going to have a core group meeting in which all the review, decision making, future programs and everything is decided in that. And there are also within that subgroups and around themes. There's a new initiative called the Vikalp Sutra, especially in terms of looking at alternative livelihood options and type of thing, which is a dedicated group within this working on that. I already mentioned about the communication group and organize the dialogues on virtual platforms called Vikalp Varta, which is there. At the moment, Kalpavruksha is the coordination it is house there or secretary help. I think the whole idea is to rotate this across different institutions who are part of it and things. In terms of financial resources, I would say it is partly funded. I mean, some of the core things we do get support from some of the a couple of donor agents who are committed to some of these ideas and things, and also partly through contributions from members and self-funded activities and things. So I think I would stop here. Sorry if I took a little bit of time more, about 5 minutes. So I mean, in case anybody has any queries or something, I can be contacted here. And SOPECOM is the institute, I'm part of it. So we have a whole lot of interesting stories on water, energy, women and natural resources, and things. We can log on to that and see some of those material there. Then I've been also working on water conflict issues. We have a larger forum in India called Forum for Policy Dialogue on Water Conflicts in India, which has been working for the last 10, 12 years. So you get a whole lot of those who are first you are interested in water per se, and also log on to some of these. Yeah. So I stop here. Thank you. Yeah. Pradesh, it's up to you now. Yeah. Over to you.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Ashish.
Yeah.
As you both know, and as everyone knows, there's already a few questions that have been coming through the chats. There was an area, an organization, or rather a collaboration that has also emerged from Vikalp Sangam, which Ashish, you're going to speak about that Julio, raised, which was the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So maybe you can wrap that first, because that's another offshoot of the work that Sangam is doing. And then we can go into some of the more specific questions.
Yes, thanks, Pratiksha. So yeah, both at a South Asia level and at a global level. So there's already discussion happening on organizing a online South Asia Vikalp Sangam to start with, and then hopefully, if our little COVID friend is agreeable, then to do a physical one next year. So anybody here from, so Bisam and anybody else here from the South Asia region, we'd be very happy to keep you informed on that and to seek your participation. That's being led by a South Asian network of feminist organizations called Sangat. So they're taking a lead on that, but we're trying to also bring in a lot of the alternative agriculture and health and education and other sorts of groups from the whole region. At the global level, some 3 years back, we started discussing with similar movements in other parts of the world to see whether there was an appetite for something similar happening at internationally or across the globe. And in fact, there was a lot of appetite. We also realized that there is, of course, the World Social Forum, which is kind of a similar forum, but there's been a lot of focus there on the critique part, the resistance, the protest, the critique, which remains important, but not so much on the alternatives. So last year we launched the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. I've put the website on the chat, so you can take a look at it for more details. The idea is a completely non-hierarchical weaving of alternatives around the world, which is why we called it a tapestry. So it's not just like Vikalp Sangam, it's not going to be an organization that becomes highly bureaucratic and top down, but really a platform. And we have so far got 40 global networks and movements to endorse it. And slowly we're beginning to sort of build activities around that. Because of the COVID lockdown, COVID situation, we've had to do a lot of our dialogues online. So we've had about 13 or 14 webinars and dialogue series. I'll put up the chat. It's on the same website that I gave you. All of them are available. So these basically showcase alternative examples from different parts of the world. So people from their own areas are able to tell people from different parts of the world on what they're doing and why they're doing it. But we're also now starting a mapping process. So mapping of not every single alternative initiative, that's impossible because there are millions, but networks of alternatives, platforms of alternatives, such as the Commons movement or the social and solidarity economy movement or indigenous self-determination movements in Latin America. So wherever there are already conglomerations or networks that are doing, then sort of mapping them, and again, not doing it top down, but enabling them to be part of the mapping process itself. So right now we're actually developing the interactive tool which will facilitate this to happen. We're also doing, we started this in India, but we're now doing it at a global level, a series of documentations on community resilience in COVID times. Because we have some most incredible examples, 2 or 3 that I gave, for instance, but amazing examples from around the world of how communities were able to be food secure, health secure, local livelihood exchanges and things like that in the midst of the COVID and the lockdown crisis. And so what are the lessons emerging from, how did that happen? What are the lessons emerging from that for the kind of recovery processes that we need from COVID? So that documentation has also begun at a more global level. We will be partnering with many other organizations for this and publishing this in many different ways. And it'll also not just be text, but also audio visual. So that's the global tapestry in a nutshell. But like I said, you can see more on the website. And it's work in progress. I mean, formally it was just launched a year back. So there's a lot more that is still to be worked out and done. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashish. Bissam, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think Ashish, thank you so much, Ashish and Joy, both of you, for your presentation. It was really interesting, and there was a lot of synergies and resonance at my end as well, because I've been, through my communities as well, I've been knowing such kind of practices as well. I was just curious about, because we had this consultation, it was sort of this focus group discussion with community-based forest enterprises and user groups in terms of green recovery post-COVID. And they were mostly indigenous and, Adivasi, as you said, like Janjatis, who are indigenous groups. We had a focus group discussions with them, and what they shared was that now at the time of COVID and also post-COVID, they're very much insecure in terms of social security, in terms of other services as well, because their forest-based enterprises are mostly informal economies. So I just wanted to, perhaps I was just curious to know whether you have any cases that you were involved in or about where nature-based enterprises have transitioned from informal economies to formal. I was just, it's rather than a question, it's a curiosity. So yeah, over. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, Joy, I'm sure you'll also have examples, but let's just to quickly talk about from the agriculture and the forestry sector. In India, there has been a still marginal but significant push to farmer and producer companies or producer cooperatives, which in fact can be legally recognized and get legal support and or state support. There is this in non-timber forest produce, there are producer companies. In agriculture, there are producer companies. In milk, I'm not sure about fisheries, but in all these other sectors. So most of the primary sectors and crafts, most of the primary sectors and small scale craft manufacture, we do have the possibility of either producer companies or producer cooperatives or self-help groups of various kinds, which can then be formally recognized by the government. But just to quickly mention also that there are dangers of formalization, which I'm sure you're aware of. You of course get into a government system. When you get into a government system, unless you're really strong, you could get sucked into all kinds of bureaucratic procedures and straitjacketed rules and regulations, which could destroy the or undermine the spirit of the process in significant ways. So what we've seen, a number of examples I've seen are, and where they've been successful and sustained the process over a period of time, is because they're internally very strong. They have very strong internal democratic decision-making processes. That becomes very important, because otherwise you might also be marginalizing the weaker sections of society when you formalize. And they are able to withstand any kind of unwelcome government pressure or straitjacketing. So that becomes very important once you formalize. But there are a number of avenues that are available. Joy, you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to, essentially what Ashish said. I find that, for example, basically formalization also would mean that some of these informal activities are being put into, for example, the type of the rules and regulations the government has set up. Now, this whole area of farmer producer companies, which is set, coming up in different parts of the country, especially promoted by civil society organizations and other things. So I would say, as Ashish said, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, it has a potential because it gives you much more collective bargaining power to the farmers. So they are not at the receiving end of traders and the middlemen or middle persons who are into that. So that is one thing, like a collective, and also this whole question about producer to consumer directly. Now there are a whole lot of linkages which are built from the producer groups, like whether it is organic agriculture, vegetables, fruits, and this all are directly sent to urban consumers and things. So both are supposed to benefit and things. Second, there is a whole lot of value addition which is being done. See, the whole issue of unequal exchange between the rural and the urban, it is basically there. And so how do you break this whole unequal exchange between the rural and the urban, or the decentralized and the centralized type of system? So how do you reverse this relationship? So there are a whole lot of efforts which are taking place. So there are a lot of value addition which is being done at different places and sell the products, not only fetches a better market, but then you can also hold the products for a longer time. So perishability and things. So there are all interesting initiatives which are getting more formalized. And there are now rules and regulations of the government, how the FPOs, that is the farmer producer companies, to work and things. And there are also other issues of policies. Now, I think, for example, which Ashish mentioned in one of the examples, this whole Kudumbashree effort in Kerala. There are certain issues. I'm not saying there are no issues, a perfect example, but this is an effort where the women, not only in terms of, self-help groups, is traditionally is like, you collect money and basically it's a lending type of institution, but they go beyond to a much more a producer group. Today in Kerala, there are a whole lot of, and it is policy, it's a government policy actually to support such groups. So they are getting into collective organic agriculture effort. They're taking land from people doing that. They're running business. Whole lot of other type of things are there, which is actually in the mainstream today. And so there are many things which I think the last 10 years we find, some of the smaller experiences or much more on the informal thing, getting into some of these things. And as she said, very often it is also operate within the capitalist logic to some extent, because with an enterprise, then profit becomes important. And so how do you then, keep a balance, things becoming an issue and things. So it also depends on the type of group which anchors these efforts, how it moves and things. Yeah, that's what I would say.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both. Over to you, Brett.
Thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Joy. I know we might have a few more questions coming in, so while others think of them, ask them, I'll ask one to start. And I think a lot of our work, you mentioned that Vikalp Sangam is, a confluence of also different kinds of practitioners. So we have activists, economists, teachers, all communities, members from all parts, but also governments. So for example, in Bhuj, Ashish, when you were sharing examples, you were talking about communities that have created their own sort of self-governance models, and you wanted to talk about different models of democracy also that have been emerging. Curious how, when we work with governance, how does the government also create, how do you work with the governments also, which are quite rigid in creating this space to create these alternatives such that they can not just be introduced, but survive and thrive?
Yeah, I think so it's a difficult balance, because it really depends on how much the community pushes the envelope. The more it seeks autonomy in terms of decision making, the more the government is going to be shaky about accepting it. So we have a whole range of uh, initiatives which are attempting to deepen democracy or make it more direct and radical. From the Central Indian Adivasi examples that I gave to others, many others, or the ones in Bhuj for urban local self-governance, insofar as they all or most of them are saying basically what we're doing is adhering to the spirit of the Indian Constitution, which in fact does encourage local, rural, and urban self-governance. They legally, it's very difficult for the government to do anything. But if those initiatives do in some way threaten some vested economic interest or threaten political interest, because they feel that our centralized power is getting much weaker, then there is also a hit back. And we've seen that in many parts of the country. For instance, an example is this movement called Pathalgadi in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh
Yeah.
area, where indigenous people, Adivasis, again argued for self-governance and self-determination. And they said explicitly, this is what the Constitution provides us. And what we're basically saying is that if the Constitution is we, the people of India, then we as village assemblies, Gram Sabhas, are actually above the Indian Parliament. We're not below it, because we are the ones who choose you. So we should be the ones actually who are controlling and where the power originates from. So they said Gram Sabha, Lok Sabha se upar, as in the village assembly is over and above the parliament in New Delhi, which is logical. I mean, if you think of it as a democracy, that's what true democracy is. But that threatened the state. So they actually very severely hit back. About 300 of the indigenous people were charged with sedition, which is the most serious charge you can make against anybody, and using some really outdated colonial laws or new ones which are extremely draconian. So I think it really varies from place to place, from the state you're doing it and how you're doing it. Even though these are all non-violent, some of them are not tolerated, others are tolerated by the state. So basically what we've been pushing for is to say that we need to recognize and accept these forms of radical direct democracy insofar as they're not threatening somebody else's autonomy. That's what Swaraj means, right? It's like I will be free and autonomous, and my community will be free and autonomous, but I'm not going to be doing things which will undermine your autonomy and freedom, as in destroy your forest or pollute your river or act violently against you. So this is we have to be able to push our notions of democracy along these lines.
Can I just
There was a
add a bit?
question from Terence, by the way, which also, after Joy finishes, I can come back to that. Terence had a
Yeah, I
question.
mean, basically what she's saying, probably we may not have a uniform answer or response in the key. It also depends on the way things are being done locally and things. But I think my take would be is that we find historically that even the state, the way it functions, it needs it, have legitimacy with the people and things. So probably the other side of looking at is that also in a way tolerate certain things, they don't think, as I said, that unless it is feeling politically threatened. So probably the issues might become different if Vikalp Sangam takes. That's one of the things we are saying, that probably if it moves into more of a more explicit political work, then we are talking about that political critical mass and other type of thing. Then probably the response of the state could be different. So I think it's always a issue about you create your autonomy and try to do certain things differently at your own spaces and things. But then how is the larger political system today and how are we moving? I think we need to work on both these legs. where in our own particular area, so the type of work we do, this autonomy, more direct democracy, alternatives and embedding and things. But I think we also find that the political system at a macro level is also moving on a reverse gear in many fronts. So how do you engage with that is also an important issue if actually we want to see that this is going to be more generalized politically. So I think that system issue still remains with us. So the more we take on that, then probably the repressive state might come back on some of these initiatives, and it is happening. That you have all type of names called urban, nexels and all type of things. People are being put behind bars, and so I think we also need to engage, and I think there's an effort within the Vikalp Sangam to engage with some of these questions and things. So I think both these things are important. This whole macro political things are happening in the country. How conducive it is for these type of alternative to prosper, and the more political stance we take and we gather a critical mass around this type of things, then how does the state respond, would respond, is something which we need to actually start thinking about it also more consciously within the Vikalp Sangam. Yeah.
These will in fact be a core part of the South Asia Vikalp Sangam process also. And in fact, some of this was also discussed in that Southeast Asia, the People's SARC forum that I mentioned during my presentation. There was a question from Terence right at the beginning, which I think is also very interesting to look at in this current phase, which is because of COVID, is there likely to be a reversal of the long-term urbanization trends? So, Terence, well, first of all, also to acknowledge Terence and the UNDP Small Grants Program has been an incredible help, I think, across the globe for community initiatives. So I should acknowledge that. And I think, Terence, it will be great to try and move also into some of these other arenas of alternatives through the SGP. In this question, so what we've seen, not just in India, but actually across the world, people are reporting how people have moved back to their villages or their small towns, as in because they just simply don't have the livelihoods anymore. And many of them, this is anecdotal. I don't know if anybody's done a research on it, but anecdotally, people in these organizations and local communities are saying a lot of them don't want to go back to the cities and the industrial zones. But the big question that arises is, do they have opportunities for dignified livelihoods back in their home villages or hometowns or not? And this is one of the reasons we recently started this thing called the Vikalp Sutra, which is, I put up the link in the chat, which is a national networking process of organizations, both those who are working for relief during the COVID period. As we know, the state structures simply could not deal with the kind of humanitarian crisis that had been created for millions of people. So a lot of civil society networks actually did that, or in fact, many of them began as a process of trying to do this. And many of them now want to move into looking at this long-term livelihood issue. So them, along with groups and networks that have already been working on livelihood, such as the examples that I gave, to try and connect them to see, okay, where people are wanting to do something differently or not wanting to come back into the cities and industrial zones or not wanting to go back into highly insecure, exploitative jobs. How can this networking enable the creation of opportunities for sustainable and dignified livelihoods wherever they are? So then that, for me, that's the biggest challenge right now for probably many parts of the world. If that happens, if that is made possible, and if we can also push policy towards that, then to my mind, urbanization may not get reversed, but it will significantly slow down. And like the examples I gave of reverse migration have already happened in the past many years, where villages have been revitalized. But that can go really much further depending on how this kind of both civil society networking and policy shifts can be enabled. Now, India announced the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the self-reliant India package, in May and June. And that could have been an incredible opportunity to do this. Unfortunately, my reading of the package is that it's not going to do this at all. In fact, it's much more pushing sectors towards commercialization and corporatization, unfortunately. So that's not going to help with this. But it is an incredible opportunity to enable this kind of reversal.
Yeah. I just add saying that it also depends on the direction the larger political economy is going to take, and the science of that is that doesn't seem to be changing much, or it is in a way using pandemic to push the entire political economy very different things, because most of these people are migrated because of the push factor from the villages, either it was economically or even socially. Now, why is that a whole lot of Dalits have been pushed out to the villages? Mainly, they made a choice because Ambedkar himself said that you are not going to get justice in these villages, and still this in many parts of the rural areas are there. So that's why they also shifted to this. So one is in terms of creating alternative livelihoods in villages or rural spaces and things so that people get a dignified livelihood. Second issue is the entire social hierarchy which is there in the village. I mean, we have seen even after the Gujarat massacre and things, village after village have passed resolutions saying that Muslims should not be allowed in the village. The same thing, the Dalit atrocities and things, so even about women. So I think both these fronts, I think we need to work. One is the whole, what I call the economic sphere and the policies and how we are going to privilege rural in terms of creating more livelihoods through processing or other type of avenues, which we are talking about. Secondly, the entire social media also need to be in a way engaged with. Otherwise, there are a lot of conflicts today. In fact, in one village where I had worked in Sangli district, the village panchayat passed a resolution. The people who came back, that the Dalits should be quarantined separately. So these type of things also come up when there are violences of a type, right from family to different levels, because there's a resource crunch there, because all of a sudden, a lot of people came back. There's a conflict also there. People cannot be absorbed into different opportunities and things. So there's a turmoil actually, taking place. So how do we actually engage and unfold these issues would be. So I would say that we need to work both, for example, the whole economic sphere, as well as the socio-cultural and other type of milieus, in the rural areas.
Thank you, Ashish. Enjoy. Sorry, there's massive construction happening in the background, but Shuman, do you want to come in with your question?
Sure, thanks, Pratt. And sorry, I'm also sitting next to Pratt, and then there are some construction activities happening behind the background. So thanks so much for the great presentation and sharing the inspiring story. I'm just quite curious to learn more about how you work with the community there, especially when you are addressing, or maybe not addressing, but actually dealing with the mental model there. Sorry for the noise. So I also typed the questions in the chat box. So I think it might be better if we can look into that. Just quite curious to learn about how we work with different contexts and also to identify their unique assets and indigenous knowledge to support their community growth. Thanks.
Joy, you want to take a first shot at that?
No, Ashish, go ahead. Yeah, yes. If there's something which I'll add, otherwise, please, yeah.
Okay, so Shumin, yes, I think this is a very, very important question. So there are maybe 2 or 3 different aspects to this. One is the knowledge part of it, which is a bit easier in the sense that for instance, if you look at examples of really successful community-based decentralized water harvesting, which Joy can I'm sure talk about more, or construction, alternative housing and construction, or any of these other fields, the examples that at least I know of are where there are hybrid knowledge systems that have worked, which means that they haven't forgotten their traditional knowledge. They're building on it, they're using it, they're building on it, but they're also adding things from the modern knowledge system that they feel is relevant. We've seen that especially with things like architecture and agriculture also to some extent. So that's a little bit easier to deal with. Of course, there's politics there, there's hegemonies there. All of that has to be tackled and challenged. But communities are able to, in many ways, sometimes maybe with help from civil society, are able to sort of make these hybrids which are relevant for them. Even with crafts, the example I gave you is exactly of that kind. But more difficult is the issue of where the traditional knowledge or system is also linked to the social hierarchies. Then if one says, let's take crafts. Now, the example I gave you of the handlooms, that handloom skill and tradition and knowledge belongs to a particular caste within that society. In fact, they are also Dalits. Now, they have actually been able to use the economic transformation to also change their social situation. But we don't have a situation where other castes, for instance, or somebody like me has gone and joined them and learned handloom weaving, so that we break the identity between the occupation or the livelihood and the caste. The same thing could happen with gender. With gender, it's broken there, because it used to be only men who were doing the handloom weaving. The women would do all the backup work. Now the women are also sitting on the loom and creating their own patterns and so on. So the gender thing is breaking, but the caste one has not. So I think this is something that sometimes communities are able to work on themselves. The Central Indian example I gave you, where people have claimed their territorial and forest rights back. They also have recognized internally, because of a lot of social mobilization in the last many years, that even though it's an indigenous society, much more egalitarian, women have never been traditionally part of the political decision making within the community. It's always been men, and mostly older men. That they're now deliberately trying to change. And again, there's a little bit of sort of civil society help with that, in terms of what laws and policies are available that could enable it. But mostly it's a local mobilization by the women or with the women, of how women's voice can be much more central to decision making also. So I think over dialogue and processes of facilitation and so on, one can continue using the wisdom of the local knowledge and traditions and so on, especially in terms of relationship with nature, but at the same time also challenge the inequality or the exploitative parts of it. And that's a very delicate balance. It's a process, it's never a project. This is always a problem with government and, if I might say so, UN agencies or other donor agencies, that there's everything is like 3 years and 5 years. But every successful initiative I've seen has been 15, 20 years in the making. It's a long process, because we're challenging something that might be 1,000 years old, or that is currently bearing down on us in terms of dominant capitalism or state domination or whatever. So yeah, that's what I would say is how one needs to, or how communities have been able to deal with this issue.
Yeah, I just want to take this discussion forward just 1 minute or two. I think, as Ashish said, most of this work actually in the rural areas basically caste-based occupation, especially when you talk about different type of artisanary work. Now the issue is that whether we will be able to break this, how difficult it is a question. Now, what we also find is that the mainstream scientific institutions, like for example, in India, we have the Department of Science and Technology. They come up with the technological options for artisan groups and type of thing, but we find that it helps them to the same artisan group coming from a particular caste background to do their work more efficiently. For example, with less time, you can produce more, or with less hard work, you can produce more. But these technologies have not been able to break open the caste barriers into these things. So can we look at, by bringing, let's say, the traditional knowledge, technologies, and synthesizing that with some of the modern possibilities? In fact, that is one area which we have been working on, let's say, for example, construction and other type of things, using natural materials like biomass and other type of things, where we find a potential that even people coming not from a particular caste background can imbibe these skills of involved in that. So this is an opportunity where different caste groups, maybe the Dalits, the women, the people who work with wood and other people can come together and produce something very different. So whether we can have this type of integrating type of thing, building on the traditional skills, but have a potential to go beyond. I think, especially when you're talking about casteless society and type of thing, the production process itself should be amenable to create a society which is that. That's one thing. Second, as Ashish said, there are issues. Now, for example, our group has been working on equitable water distribution. We are saying that even landless people, Dalits, should get access to water for their production avenues like agriculture. We created, the local groups created there, but the Dalits said, look, primary production or agriculture is not this one. We need other type of jobs and other type of things. So it takes it, because it also comes with very historical baggage and things. So I think both these things are very important to keep in mind, and things. And caste, especially in societies like India, is very, as Ashish said, is very difficult to break that open. So how do you look at possibilities of where we create avenues, technologies, and knowledge where this can be taken? And it's a very difficult process. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ashish, Joy. We're just a couple minutes away from wrapping. And I think, Ashish, you said something at the end. I mean, Joy, I think your answer just now hit on so many layers that we have to do our work in. And I think especially the kind of work we do at UNDP in partnership with communities, so much of it is having a very deep historical analysis of why we are where we are. Why are the fragilities in the system, the fragilities that they are as they're showing up, before we can look at the alternative futures that our current situation and context offers us. And I think, Ashish, you mentioned something very important that I think we're definitely, thinking more and more deeply about is the issues we work on have at minimum a generation, before which we can seek real change, and project cycles of 1 to 3 years hardly do that justice unless they're a 5-year of a 30-year life cycle. But maybe in the final minute, we have any last, final thoughts you might want to share with our colleagues at UNDP to take forward. Why is it so important that organizations like Vikalp Sangam, and I say organizations loosely because I know we don't operate in that same terminology, but why does Vikalp Sangam really provide an important point of context to the work that we do at UNDP?
So yeah, you ended with the question that needs another hour and a half. But no, Pratiksha, maybe just to sort of say that I think what the Vikalp Sangam provides institutions like ours or UNDP or the government, if the government has is sensitive, is the opportunities of firstly listening to people on the ground, their own issues, problems, their own knowledge, their own ideas on how to solve things, and a collective space where those kinds of voices can be enhanced, made more holistic, made more critical, constructively critical. And from all of that, the solutions that need to emerge. And if we do that, then these are solutions that are emerging not only from local communities, but with them, and sometimes or often by them, which then makes the actual practice of reaching the solution much more sustainable and much deeper, rather than if the solutions are emerging from so-called think tanks and government institutions or top-down institutions. So I think that the Vikalp Sangam is one is that. Secondly, this is something that's true for me in my own life, that we see so much gloom and doom around, and there's so much mayhem and destruction and devastation and all kinds of social atrocities and so on going on, that one can often kind of just get paralyzed with just the bad news. And I think what the Vikalp Sangam enables is to say that however bad the situation might be, there are also ways out. There are good things happening. There are solutions. There are amazing stories of resilience and innovation. And we just need to engage with them and build on them to continue having hope and inspiration. I think that's, for me in my life, that's been an enormous contribution by all these communities and initiatives, because otherwise for me, it's like this daily dose of bad news. I stopped reading the newspaper, by the way, or opening the news channels on the screen. But nevertheless, one still gets all the bad news. So I think that's something that's really, and if the UN process can help with that, that would be great. Thanks.
I don't think I have much to add. I think Ashish has actually summarized the whole thing. I think just two minor things. One is that we need to talk to each other. We need to create these spaces for multi-sectoral, multi-issue dialogues and things. And I think from that point of view, the Sangam process, who have been quite actively involved in that, have been a very transformative process. Even getting exposed to the type of diversity of things that people are doing itself is a very transforming experience. So I think one of the things which we need to do much is how do you open up these type of conversations in a non-judgmental manner and try to learn and transform each other, and type of this is an important thing. Second, which I personally is interested in, is to how to take this conversation to much more political movements and things. And I feel that is one area we need to, we had this discussion within the Vikalp Sangam quite a bit, and we made efforts in different Sangams to get this group. So I think somewhere we need to do that. For both. Even for political movements also, I think need to engage with these real world experiences, because by merely demanding something the state, things are not going to change. So we need to learn so that will sharpen this, the demands of the movements put up, and the way they mobilize people around. So I think these cross conversations, we can aid and take it forward. I think it will be mutually enriching, and that will lead to much more transformative type of efforts. And this, so I think this is where some of us are interested. I think we need to move this conversation to that levels, and this is happening across. It's not only for example, farmers movements or Adivasi movements or working class movements or even women's movements. There have been this type of dichotomy, not talking to each other and type of thing. So through this constructive experience which have been created by type of thing, and the political movements have to, I think, somewhere need to come together much more consciously and take. It can be very mutually enriching, and I think it's a need of the hour today, the way things are happening. Yeah.
No doubt. Thank you both, and thank you to everyone that came through for this hour-and-a-half session. I think, as both Joy and Ashish and others have hinted, that I think a conversation like this was meant as an introductory framework to introduce, some of the general spaces in which that Vikalp Sangam operates. And maybe we can take a second conversation, deep diving into some of the critical issues where, where our interests and work intersects, and maybe going a bit deeper. So thank you so much, Ashish. Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you to everyone, and look forward to a next one soon.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Pratiksha. Thanks to everybody.
Nice. Yeah. Okay, Pratiksha. And
thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Stay safe. Have a good day.
Bye, Ashish. Yeah. Bye.
You as well. Thank you so much.